Hello folks, I'm Alex, this is Alex Unabridged, and these are my thoughts on Foundation by Isaac Asimov. So welcome back to the channel if that is the case. So yes, it's time to take a look at the first proper classic science fiction book on my list for science fiction for the somewhat hesitant. The first in the ABCs of science fiction, and that is an A of Isaac Asimov with Foundation from 1951. This is set thousands of years into an imagined future for humanity, and the book begins kind of at the heart of the galactic empire. The empire has prospered for around 12,000 years at this point, but we meet Harry Seldon, who is a psychohistorian, and his particular branch of study applies statistical analysis, so mathematics, to mass groups of humans, analysing kind of behaviour patterns, etc., to predict future events. Through his scientific study, he foresees the imminent collapse of the empire, plunging the galaxy into a great era of barbarism. Seldon has a plan, however, to reduce the coming Dark Ages from a potential period of 30,000 years to a mere 1,000. Well, the Empire and the Emperors don't like being told that the Empire's about to collapse, so they exile Seldon to a desolate planet on the edge of the galaxy, where Seldon establishes a colony of some of the greatest minds in the Empire. This is the Foundation, and this holds the secret to changing the fate of the galaxy. And so begins the Foundation era. The book is split into 5 parts, like 5 novellas, each part jumping forwards in time a little bit to look at a different group of people and how they manage the crises that were predicted by Seldon, and how the power shifts among the different factions as well, and also how Seldon's plan to stave off this extended Dark Ages is playing out. Okay, right. In a nutshell verdict is it's a little bit of a tricky one, this one, to give you a succinct opinion on, because my feelings towards it are quite complicated. But here goes. Simply put, I liked it, but I didn't love it. I have a lot of criticisms on it, but despite that, I can't help but be intrigued by a lot of it. It feels like an unfinished story because it is. There are 2 more books in the trilogy, in the main trilogy, and then further stuff beyond that in terms of sequels and prequels, which were written at a later date. It definitely feels like this is the beginning of something. And so it's kind of a little bit difficult for me to judge it on its own. So even though I had significant issues with some of it, I can't help but find myself kind of tempted down the rabbit hole with this one, and wanting to find out more about what happens next, and just the general kind of the history and the lore that goes along with this ambitious vision of a future that's tens of thousands of years, away in the future. So let's get into details about the various elements of the storytelling, and then maybe I can kind of elaborate on some of my thoughts about what I think it does do well, and some of the stuff that it falls down on for me. So let's start off, as always, with character. The characters are poorly drawn. They're sketches of people in the most part. There are some memorable characters in it, in each of the 5 parts. Some of the most significant characters do reoccur, if only in reference, in further parts, further down the timeline. Harry Seldon, obviously, is an important one, of course, as is someone like Salva Hardin from kind of the second and third parts. And Master Trade Mallow is another one that's felt much more kind of more built on slightly. But even with these characters, I couldn't really tell you that much about them. I couldn't tell you much about what they looked like, who they are, beyond their very sort of specific role in the story regarding kind of the political maneuverings that they're involved in. The characters kind of feel essentially kind of like spokesmen for the ideas of the book, and as kind of vehicles to kind of move the plot forwards. So yeah, the characters are sketchy at best, but that is not what this book is about really, and we'll get to that in the future. Something that Troy did warn me about when he recommended this book as part of my kind of introduction to classic sci-fi, and he's not wrong on this point, is the almost complete absence of female characters. There's one basically that I can think of, and she's an extremely minor character. She's the wife of a commodore, a kind of a leader of a planet that we come to later in the book, and she serves very little purpose other than to kind of let us know that her kind of her marriage to this commodore is not particularly happy, but it's basically an alliance. It was done in an alliance with another leader of another planet, so it's kind of setting up more the kind of the political situation, but she doesn't have much of a character at all. Women really aren't mentioned that much in the book. They don't seem to bear much importance in Asimov's world at all, certainly not in Foundation anyway. So yeah, the character diversity is kind of a little non-existent in that respect. So yeah, character was probably the weakest thing I think about the whole book. So my score for character reflects that, and that is a 3 out of 10. Okay, the atmosphere, setting, world building, etc. Again, I'm quite torn on this one. It's a story of two halves really for me. In terms of elements that help me visualize the setting and get a sense of the atmosphere on the various different sort of planets that we kind of go to, there's not much. That's one of my major criticisms again, is that I found it really difficult to get a visual grounding of what the world looked like and what it felt like to exist in, the kind of the general aesthetics of some of the places. There was hints, but there was nothing really to kind of hook onto, and that's kind of a big deal for me. I'm a very visual reader, and I felt somewhat that I was kind of floating somewhere on the periphery of things, and kind of as such that affected my immersion definitely, and that then affected my engagement with it at times. But on the other hand, away from the visual side of things, the world building in terms of the political and sociological, economic makeup of the galaxy, the Foundation's position in the kind of the political landscape, and the shifts in power and power dynamics, that was really interesting, and that really gave me a clear sense of how the world was working and changing. You know, it is at its heart, this book, somewhat a series of political discussions, diatribes on occasion, and that was something that really worked in the world building, I think, for me. I can't deny that the scope and scale of what Asimov came up with here is really impressive, and I've only just scratched the surface. I don't know enough about his other work yet, but for me it has an air of the Tolkien to it, if you know what I mean, in terms of the span of time and the scope of the world and all of the different kind of mechanisms that are at play. Yeah, it feels like Foundation, I've kind of barely scratched the surface on this, and I have to say the rabbit hole of kind of the history and lore that kind of potentially exists across other Asimov's books and, you know, series, etc. That's a tempting rabbit hole to fall down, I have to say. So although the visual aspect of world building and stuff isn't there for me at all, the workings of the world, the rules of the world, the politics, etc., that really is. So my score for atmosphere, setting, and world building is a 5 out of 10. Okay, writing. Yeah, Asimov's style is okay, I think is probably what I'd say. It can be quite dry at times. That affects my engagement of it, certainly. There is a hell of a lot of dialogue in this. The majority of the book kind of consists of conversations in rooms. I would say probably 75 to 80% of it is conversations in rooms. It can be a bit too talky sometimes for me. It got a little bit tedious at certain points for me. It wasn't overly complex though, in terms of I didn't have any trouble understanding any of it. What Asimov was saying. The language is direct, to the point, so it's very accessible in that regard. There's a decent flow to it. There is some humour to it. But yeah, my engagement waned a little in parts just due to the sheer amount of this kind of discussion. Discussion versus action, certainly. There's not a huge amount of action in this at all. To say there were moments of entertaining, humorous dialogue, or some sort of pleasing descriptions, that kind of thing within the prose that gave me little glimpses of character or place or what have you. I've got one here. Yeah, just this little description. It was a tall man that eventually entered, a man whose face seemed all vertical lines and so thin that one could wonder whether there was room for a smile. I quite like that. And then, on the next page, it continues. Avakim smiled frostily, and it turned out that there was room for it on his thin face after all. His cheeks wrinkled to make the room. So yeah, it's quite simple and stuff, but I quite like that description. There's just a nice little bit of kind of, sort of character built into that description, but that, there's not a huge amount other than that in terms of description. It's snippets of things. But yeah, it served its purpose, I think, is how I describe Asimov's style. It was competent, very competent, and it was easy to follow. And the dialogue definitely did some heavy lifting when it came to getting any sense of character. So there is some there. It's just not enough for me. There were a couple of instances of repetition in terms of descriptions that were noticeable, I think, to me though, and just niggled me a bit. For instance, in the latter parts of the book, I think it's either in part 4 or 5, there's a constant use of the descriptor sardonically when it comes to speech. Everything was said sardonically, and I was a bit like, oh, come on, dude, find a different descriptor. It's a little niggle for me, but it's something that jumps out at me. That kind of thing, that kind of repetition jumps out at me. And it's just, it just pulls me out a little bit when I see a repetition there. So my score for writing is a 6 out of 10. Okay, onto plot and kind of structure as well then. So yes, the way that the book is structured in these 5 parts, kind of essentially 5 novellas, each one jumping forwards in time to the next kind of political or sociological kind of crisis, as predicted by Selden. That works well in terms of world building for me. Although the time jumps also have a kind of an adverse effect of making the work also feel a little bit fractured in other ways. It does feel a little bit disjointed or jarring at times to get these jumps. But I kind of get why this is. As far as I'm aware, Asimov published these parts separately in a science fiction magazine, and they were then, collected together eventually to become Foundation and the Foundation trilogy. So I can understand why it therefore feels maybe a little bit jarring. As I've mentioned, the amount of kind of exposition and discussions through dialogue, these conversations in rooms, got a little bit tedious at times and therefore affected the pacing a little bit for me. But at the end of each part, there was always a little bit of a spike in that pacing. And there's a little bit of action or a reveal or something like that that came into play. Some great little reveals in this. And when, you know, it's kind of whenever I felt like I was almost ready to throw in the towel because it was getting a bit tedious because of the conversations in rooms, I suddenly found myself pulled back in and kind of then eager to find out what happened next and get into the next part. So it definitely left me wanting to know more. And something I would say as well is like the plot to a modern reader who's got some kind of knowledge of, you know, science fiction generally, whether it's movies or what have you, you know, the story doesn't feel, you know, wholly unique because we've seen so much over the 70 years since it was published. At the time, from what I gather, this was, you know, it was a new thing. It was a really new thing. And so I think you've got to take that into account, that this is, you know, it is the foundation, if you like, for modern science fiction, or a lot of modern science fiction. So yeah, I've got to give credit for that. And it is, you know, as I say, in terms of its scope and stuff, it is phenomenal. So my score for plot is a 7 out of 10. I enjoyed the plot, it was good. Okay then, ideas. Now, let's face it, that's what this book is. It is primarily a book of ideas, big ideas. The biggest being that of Asimov's vision for the future. The fall of this galactic empire over 10,000 years from now. The size and scope of this future history, if you like, is kind of mind-boggling. And, you know, as I say, it's just one book in many that exists within Asimov's timeline, if you like. There are elements of the world that are referenced in Foundation that we don't get to know anything about in this book at all, such as the fact that a second Foundation was formed right on the other side of the galaxy from the one that we kind of get into in this. And by the end of this book, by the end of Foundation, we're only about, I think, 100 years or so into the Foundation era. And so if things go the way that Selden predicts and hopes for, we've got 900 years remaining of various crises, etc., shifts in the balance of power, before a new empire and new kind of enlightened age begins. And I personally love the prospect of this kind of this scale, this history. In terms of the science side of things, of the science fiction, I had been concerned going into this that the science within it might be a bit hard for my tastes, but actually it's really not. In fact, apart from the space side of things, you know, and some futuristic gadgets and stuff like that, the science of the science fiction is quite sparse in terms of what you'd think of with science, if you say science. Like the concept of psychohistory as a statistical kind of mathematical discipline, which combines, as I say, statistics with sociology, political science, etc. That's fascinating, but unfortunately I don't think I got enough of that science side of things for my liking. I would have liked to have known more about that kind of statistical analysis of psychohistory. The way it's presented is kind of a little hand-wavy, for want of a better expression. We're told of its importance and of the importance of Selden's work, obviously, his work and his thesis. But other than that, it's sort of waved away a little bit by other characters. I'm not too critical on the lack of deeper explanation on it, especially in terms of the maths, as I think that could become a little bit too mind-melting and make for a less kind of coherent story. But I maybe would have liked a little bit more on the science side of things. Psychohistory, for me, would better be named psychosociology, because that's what it is at its core for me. The science we're looking at in Foundation is predominantly social science. And there's no complaints from me on that front at all. You know, I've studied social sciences, I've got degrees in social sciences, I find it fascinating. And so on that score, you know, it really worked for me. The execution of some of the discussions about the sociological and political ideas is perhaps maybe a little simplified. In each part, there's basically a discussion or argument between the two opposing sides, each vying for power, and a course of action that seems inevitable, kind of until the victor comes up with an approach that ensures that they gain the upper hand. Which is often kind of expressed in a bit of a kind of a aha, but you didn't think of that, did you? Kind of sort of way. So yeah, it's done well enough that it's engaging for me, that bit, but it's maybe a little bit simplistic. It's a little bit black and white in a lot of ways. There's not a huge amount of the grey area explored, but it is interesting nonetheless. And it illustrates quite succinctly and effectively some of the ways that the various machinery of power structures can be used to either one side's advantage or another. The ideas about control through religion or free trade as a means of maintaining peace between trading factions, things like that are quite engaging, albeit somewhat, as I say, somewhat a little simplistic. The shifting of power from one faction to another, from one form of governance to another, and the manipulation at play in that how that power is wrangled is also a large part, I think, of why I found this book interesting, despite not feeling connected to the world and the characters in other ways. And in Foundation, we only get to see a couple of these crises where power shifts and the political and sociological economic landscape changes. And I think that's what intrigues me about reading on in the series. I want to see how the world, how the galaxy will change next. So my score for ideas is an 8 out of 10. Yeah, it was great. So enjoyment then. Yeah, it's a strange one, Foundation. I did enjoy it and I didn't. There were numerous bits where it felt very slow and dry, boring even. But something always pulled me back in and kept me reading. I think it was a very different reading experience from what I'm used to. Generally, I like to be sucked into a world full of complex characters, a world I can really see visually, kind of really clearly visualize and connect with. This certainly ain't the experience that I had with Foundation. But I think I ended up reading it with a different mindset because of that. I kind of read it almost as an outsider, if you know what I mean, in that I'm not in the world with its inhabitants, kind of getting involved in, getting lost in this world. More like I'm reading a series of historical records. I'm an observer of that. And when I think about the experience in that context, it was more enjoyable than I thought it was going to be, kind of going into it. As I said before, I'm definitely intrigued by what comes next. There's enough to make me curious about reading further, for sure. And when Asimov did give me bits of action, though action might be a bit of a strong description, let's just say when he kind of lets us out of the meeting rooms and lets us peek into some other areas of the galaxy and see a little bits of potential conflict. Those bits were actually really engaging. Those were the bits that kind of pulled me back and kind of kept me in it. So I did enjoy it, but there was, as I say, there was quite a bit that also I didn't enjoy about it. So my score for enjoyment is a 6 out of 10. It was okay. So when we add up all the various bits, the various marks from the categories, and divide by 6, we get 5.83, which I will round up to a 6 out of 10. So 6 out of 10 is the overall score for Foundation. That will go on Storygraph at a 3-star. So yeah, somewhere kind of in the middle. It was okay. Overall it was okay. There were some bits that I really didn't like about it, and some bits that I really did. So yes. So yeah, I enjoyed the experience far more than I thought I would going in. Even though some of the stuff that I'm critical of, like I don't like the style, the lack of visualization, or the lack of things to grab onto for visualization, things like that. Yeah, despite those, I can't help but be enticed into reading more. I mentioned the kind of the Tolkien-esque feeling that I got from kind of the scope of this world. And I think that's the crux of it for me, really. I think the potential for the kind of the law, the politics, the power, all that kind of stuff, the shifts, balance of power, that's what's got me with this. It intrigues me. This feels like Foundation feels like it's got kind of the potential to kind of suck me into that kind of rabbit hole, essentially, that Asimov's timeline as a whole I could find really fascinating to look at. So definitely I will definitely be continuing on with more Asimov. I have looked at the summary for the second book in the Foundation trilogy, and I have to say that intrigued me on its own. You know, there's mention of a character called the Mule, who I think is a mutant, perhaps, and something that Selden couldn't have predicted. So I'm guessing that's going to throw a spanner in the works of his plan. So that is definitely intriguing. So going forwards, I will definitely read some more Asimov. I've always been interested in reading I, Robot as well. While we're on that, if anybody knows the timeline better, you know, obviously better than me, but if they know it well, if you've got any kind of thoughts on reading order of things, you know, by publication date, is it better to read in the sort of the chronology of the timeline, things like that? Is there a mix? You know, are there some things that I really need to have read before I tackle something else? You know, just so I don't spoil things for myself, that kind of thing. Then yeah, do let me know if you've got any input on that kind of thing. So yeah, as I say, a strange one this. The review score of 6 out of 10 normally wouldn't indicate that I was that bothered about continuing on with the series, but as I say, it's this one thing, it's the ideas side and the kind of the scope of it, etc., that's just kind of, it's really intrigued me. So we'll keep going. If at any point I kind of go, no, I'm done, then no harm done. But you know, definitely it's one worth digging into, I think, for me. So that will do from me today. Thank you very much for watching, folks. As always, do drop your thoughts, etc., in the comments below. I will be having a bit of a break on Sunday, so there'll be no video from me on Sunday, but I will be back on Tuesday or Wednesday with my Garb August Wasted Weekend wrap-up. So I do hope you will join me for that then. But from me, for now, that's ta-ra.